December 1941. After 5 months of victories, the German army was close enough to Moscow for the city to feel almost within reach. Later stories claimed German soldiers could see the Kremlin through binoculars. Whether they truly did is disputed. What is certain is that they would get no closer. Machines behind the advance were breaking down, engines froze, rifles jammed. Men wrapped themselves in newspapers because the winter clothing they needed had never arrived. Then fresh Soviet armies came out of the snow and attacked. Hitler had expected the Soviet Union to collapse in weeks. Instead, his army had reached the edge of its strength before it reached the center of Moscow. How could an invasion that won so many battles fail so completely? The answer begins 6 months earlier, on the longest front the world had ever seen. For sunrise on June 22, 1941, nearly 4 million Axis troops waited along the Soviet border. More than 3,000 tanks and thousands of aircraft stood ready across a front almost 1,800 miles wide. At 3:15 in the morning, the horizon erupted. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, had begun. 3 army groups drove east, north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south toward Ukraine. Hitler believed the campaign would be over before winter. He said the Soviet system was rotten and needed only one hard kick to collapse. That belief shaped everything: the timetable, the supplies, even the uniforms. Germany did not prepare for a long war because its leaders had decided a long war was impossible. This was also more than a struggle over territory. Barbarossa was designed as an ideological war of conquest and racial annihilation. Millions of Soviet prisoners would be deliberately starved, neglected, or shot. Behind the front, mobile killing units began murdering Jewish communities and other civilians. The brutality was not a side effect of the campaign. It was built into it, turning the occupied population into victims, refugees, and enemies with nothing left to lose. On the Soviet side, the warnings had been piling up for months. Spies, diplomats, border troops, and foreign governments all reported that an attack was coming. Stalin dismissed much of it as British deception or German provocation. He knew war with Germany was likely someday. He simply refused to believe Hitler would begin it now, before Britain had been defeated. The Red Army was still recovering from Stalin's purges of its officer corps. Many units had inexperienced commanders and no clear plan for a sudden assault. So when the guns opened fire, Soviet commanders were caught between the evidence in front of them and orders from Moscow that had come too late. The first weeks looked like proof that Hitler had been right. German panzer groups broke through the frontier, raced deep behind Soviet lines, then turned inward to close enormous traps. At Bialystok and Minsk, then again near Smolensk, entire Soviet armies disappeared inside the pincers. Soviet units counterattacked wherever they could, often without air cover or coordination. Many were destroyed, but their resistance cost the German columns fuel, machines, men, and time. Columns of prisoners filled the roads. By the end of the summer, more than 2 million Soviet soldiers had been captured. Aircraft burned on their airfields, tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel, headquarters lost contact with units that no longer existed. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Now German commanders watched victories arrive even faster and assumed the Soviet Union was already dying. But each victory carried the army farther from the system, keeping it alive. German supply columns depended heavily on horses and a limited number of trucks. Dust-ruined engines, spare parts ran short, and the roads often existed only on maps. Soviet railways used a different gauge, so captured tracks had to be rebuilt before German trains could use them. Fuel and ammunition moved east while damaged vehicles, wounded men, and empty trucks moved west. Every extra mile consumed more of the supplies it delivered. And the Red Army kept fighting. It had lost armies, aircraft, and much of its command structure, but it had not lost the ability to raise new formations. Soviet reserves came forward from the interior. Factories were dismantled and moved east. The state absorbed losses that German planning had treated as fatal. Industrial plants traveled by rail toward the Urals and Siberia, sometimes restarting in unfinished buildings. Soviet war production was escaping beyond Germany's reach. This was the arithmetic at the heart of Barbarossa. Germany could win battle after battle and still fall behind the war it needed to finish. Then the campaign split around a question with no easy answer. Should the main effort drive straight for Moscow or first destroy Soviet armies farther south? Hitler sent major armored forces toward Ukraine. His generals protested that Moscow was the decisive target. Near Kiev, the German pincers closed around one of the largest pockets in military history. More than 600,000 Soviet troops were killed or captured. The battlefield also delivered warnings. Soviet T-34 and KV tanks shocked German crews with armor and firepower their own weapons struggled to defeat. Kiev was a staggering German victory. It also consumed weeks, fuel, vehicles, and men that could not be replaced quickly. Historians still debate whether an earlier drive on Moscow could have succeeded. What is not debated is that the Germans resumed that drive with less time and a stronger enemy waiting. Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, began on October 2. Once again, German armor tore open the front and closed around Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands more Soviet troops were trapped. To German commanders, it looked like the last great victory before the capital fell. But the encircled pockets kept fighting for days. While German infantry reduced them, Soviet commanders used the time to rebuild a defensive line closer to Moscow. In October, the rain began. The autumn mud, the Rasputitsa, dissolved roads into black trenches. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses died in harness. Infantry marched while the supply columns stalled behind them. Blitzkrieg was built on movement. The Soviet landscape was stripping that movement away. Then the temperature dropped, the mud hardened, and for a brief moment movement returned. But the cold kept falling, lubricants thickened, batteries failed, weapons had to be warmed before they could fire. Many German soldiers still wore summer uniforms. Frostbite removed men from the line as efficiently as bullets. Winter did not arrive out of nowhere and defeat an otherwise perfect plan. It exposed a plan already failing under Soviet resistance, distance, mechanical losses, and impossible assumptions. Still, Army Group Center drove toward Moscow. The Germans captured towns around the capital and reached its outer approaches. Panic spread through Moscow, but the Soviet government stayed. On October 16, panic gripped Moscow. Stalin stayed, and on November 7, Soviet troops paraded through Red Square before marching toward the front. Civilians dug anti-tank ditches. Workers formed militia units. Trains carried government offices east while other trains brought soldiers toward the city. Soviet intelligence now judged that Japan was unlikely to attack Siberia in the immediate future. That allowed Stalin to shift well-equipped formations from the Far East and other reserves toward Moscow. They were not a magical army, but they arrived when Germany had almost nothing left. By early December, German battalions were shadows of the forces that had crossed the border in June. They were near Moscow. Near was not the same as capable of taking it. On December 5, the Red Army counterattacked across the frozen front. Soviet troops hit exhausted German positions with infantry, cavalry, tanks, and ski units, forcing them away from the capital. Vehicles and guns were abandoned in the snow. Units that had expected a final victory now fought simply to avoid being cut off. Hitler forbade broad retreat and dismissed senior commanders. In some places, the stand-fast orders prevented panic. In others, they turned military judgment into obedience to one man's will. The Germans eventually stabilized the front, but the campaign they had planned was over. Barbarossa had one essential requirement: destroy the Soviet Union quickly. By December, that requirement had failed. Eastern Front would continue for almost 4 more years. Its battles, occupations, starvation, and mass murder would kill tens of millions. The Red Army was still wounded and would suffer more disasters. Germany would still advance again. Nothing about final victory was guaranteed in the snow outside Moscow. But the kind of war had changed. Germany now faced a contest of manpower, industry, fuel, and endurance against enemies whose combined resources it could not match. The failure was not caused by one storm, one wrong turn, or one delayed attack. It came from an entire campaign built on contempt for the enemy and fantasy about the cost. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's greatest gamble. The moment the quick victory vanished, Nazi Germany was trapped in a war it could not survive. Next time, Iwo Jima. After that, you decide. Tell us which battle or campaign we should cover in the comments.